Hi, everyone. My name is Sana Magani, and I am an associate partner on the programs team at Catalyst Ed. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Rachel Klein, who is our VP of, I don't know your title.
I'm our VP of programs. Hello.
And today we are having a really important conversation about the overlap and intersection of Ramadan and Passover. I am a Muslim American and celebrate Ramadan, and I invited Rachel to have this conversation with me today because while we've known each other for a number of years and we've talked about these holidays, the special time of the overlap really helped us to think about how can we draw lessons from our faith and from especially these holidays into our work about, a more just and equitable world, but thinking about liberation, oppression, and what role can we play as interfaith and intercultural community members in really moving forward the needle in racial equity. So I invited Rachel for this talk today, and I'm really excited to dig in about Ramadan, Passover, and what we can all learn from these holidays.
Yeah. And well, I have long known that our religions are more similar than they are different. You have taught me so much more about Islam, Sana, than I had ever known before. And so thank you for that gift and for this conversation.
Yeah, no, thanks for joining me. And I also want to acknowledge before we get started that this is a hard conversation for us to have for a number of reasons. It's uncomfortable to be so open about our faith, about these core identity markers of what makes us who we are. And I'd like to share just a little bit here about particularly why it's a moment of vulnerability for me. So I grew up in the South and post 9/11 America as a Pakistani Muslim immigrant. And I remember where I was in school when 9/11 happened. I remember the conversations that my parents had that day and the following days. And I remember the fear that I could feel in our community, whether it was, at our gathering place at the mosque or in community centers or at home. There was this fear that if our friends or neighbors or other white Americans found out who we were, we may have to leave our homes. We may be subject to hate and discrimination. And I remember there was a moment where my dad sat me and my sister down and said, "Don't tell anyone you're Muslim, right? Don't tell anyone you're Muslim. Don't tell anyone you weren't born here. If you have to, say we're from Nepal." And that was his way of protecting his little girls. And so I've come a long way to this moment where I'm openly on the internet sharing about my faith and my community. And I also just want to acknowledge that Catalyst has created a space for me to feel safe and given me the support and mentorship through Rachel and many others. And so I want to acknowledge them too, but say that it's pretty hard for both of us.
Yeah, indeed, indeed. Well, so Sana, why don't you kick us off? What are some of our similarities, overlaps, or parallels?
Yeah. So one theme, as I was thinking and reflecting on both Passover and Ramadan, one theme that I think is probably the most prominent is the one of oppression and liberation. Both Passover and Ramadan really celebrate this historic struggle against oppression and the journey towards liberation. So in Passover, as I've learned from Rachel and others, Jews celebrate the liberation from slavery in Egypt, while in Ramadan, one of the things that Muslims are asked to consider is the struggle of Prophet Muhammad and his followers against oppression in Mecca and what that journey looked like from Mecca to Medina. But I want to say that the story of the Prophet, while it's pivotal and important, is one that is far away from my current reality. And so I draw a lot of reflections from that story, and they're part of the reflections that we have during Ramadan in the Muslim community. But really, for me, I think about that historic oppression and struggle and realize how it hasn't ended today. And so it isn't a thing in the past for me, it is a thing in the present for me. And so I think about the struggle of my brothers and sisters in the Middle East, particularly in Gaza and in Palestine. I think about the millions of refugees who have been displaced out of Syria, Afghanistan, Iraq due to often unnecessary conflict and war. And I think about how their oppression globally and their struggle globally continues to exist and persist today in a world where we have the resources and means to find opportunities for liberation for everybody. And so, especially during Ramadan, I'm thinking about those who are suffering. I'm thinking about those who are still in a fighting for liberation globally. And also, it is hard to ignore then the injustice and racial equity that exists within my own backyard. And so when I think about Prophet Muhammad's struggle, I start to think about those who are suffering internationally, but then we haven't actually achieved racial equity and liberation in this country either. And so my Ramadan is significant for me because it's that moment to pause and recognize that there is oppression existing today. And what can I do in my locus of control to change that, to impact that?
Yeah, and this is the most meaningful thing about Passover to me as well, the fact that Jewish people sit down every year and recall a time when we were oppressed, or multiple times, depending on how you what Haggadah you're reading. It has always forced me to think about what life was like for my ancestors during that oppression, and then what life is like for others who are or have been historically oppressed, and therefore how important that liberation is for anyone in that circumstance. I believe it's why I have such a strong drive to see society be more fair and just. And I believe it is why there are so many Jews who work in the field of social justice. It's a repetitive thing that happens for us annually to remember this time and remember the suffering. And it just always really drives me. And this leads to, I think, the second similarity, which is probably the most obvious to non-Muslims and non-Jews, and that is about food and justice. So both Passover and Ramadan involve dietary restrictions that serve as a reminder of the importance of justice and ethical consumption. Also of symbols of the times during our oppression and our liberation. So Passover requires that Jews avoid leavened bread, as probably a lot of people in America know, but also we eat foods to remind ourselves, as the story is told, or we don't eat foods, that remind us of the haste with which the Jewish people had to flee in order to find liberation. Which is a story that can be found in like nearly every other oppressed people's attempts at liberation historically and even today. I think if we think of the Afghans trying to flee Afghanistan when the US declared to finally pull out, I think that necessity to make haste continues to be something that people live desperately every day in the United States. And the story is ages old and continues even to this day. There's a lot of other food symbolism in the Seder as well, like salt water for tears and bitter or spicy foods to signify the collective suffering. But Sana, your daily fast for the whole month of Ramadan is much more of a marathon compared to our sprint or 10K. So tell me a little bit about those food symbols.
Yeah, so Ramadan is a month-long, you're right, marathon of fasting. So for the 30 days or 29 days, depending on how the lunar calendar falls, we fast during daylight hours. So from sun up to sundown. It's the month of April right now, so it's not so bad. But when Ramadan falls on the summer months and you're fasting for close to 10 to 12 hours of daylight hours, it is challenging. So I am thankful that this year in March and April. But really, when you strip away food and when you strip away water, and if you actually stop and pause for a second, like a lot of our day is organized around food, like breakfast, lunch, dinner, thinking about your snack, thinking about what you're going to the store. But when you take away all of that, fasting is really seen as a way of cultivating empathy and compassion and awareness of the struggle of others. And so when you're not focused on eating, when you're not focused on your thirst and your own hunger, you start to shift your focus and awareness inward. You start to think about your body in a way beyond what just your physical needs are, and sitting with your hunger, sitting with your thirst, sitting with how hard it is to get through the day without those basic necessities really forces you to think about the millions of people globally and even within your own local community that have to live with that day in, day out. And that is not a choice that they make. And once you start to expand the focus outside of your own body and your own suffering, you start to realize that there are folks in your community who have needs that potentially you and other community members can come together and support them on. And so a big part about Islam is fasting, but another pillar of Islam is called zakat, which means to give charity. And so Ramadan is a really great time to think about, what can I do without? Can I donate clothes? Can I start to volunteer more in my community? Do I have additional monetary support that I can provide to my community in need? And it's truly a community effort. If you've ever stopped by a local mosque during Ramadan, during a food drive or a big event, it is all about what can we do together to support others in need. And when you're fasting, and you're aware of your own suffering and start to expand that, it really allows for more compassion to grow within your heart and within the community.
And we
And
do this on Yom Kippur just for the day, but
Mhm.
similarly, there's a food drive, and there's lots of talk about how this pain that we're experiencing now is an ever-present thing for other people in the world, and something that we can do something about.
Mhm.
And then there's also the Hebrew word, or the Jewish principle of tzedakah, which is charity. And so, on a weekly, for some Jews visit the synagogue, there's also the weekly act of charity that
Yeah.
goes along with that on Shabbat.
Yeah. I think just as I'm hearing you speak and we're talking about Passover and Ramadan, ultimately it boils down to taking a pause to away from your daily life to really think about oppression and injustice and the suffering of others. That's really what it comes down to. Whether it's you refrain from food and drink or leavened bread, or whether you sit with your family and you have a meal and you talk about the challenges that we have faced historically and continue to face today, it's really about taking a pause. And I guess if anyone out there is listening, you don't have to be Jewish or Muslim, obviously, to do that, but taking a pause to consider what is the experience of others is a really great practice. And I know one that in social impact work is one that we probably don't do enough. And so a little nugget out there to, if you're listening and you want to, at the end of this, maybe take a pause and reflect on in what ways can you support your community and how your work is for furthering social justice. So our final similarity is one that, always is challenging, probably for you haven't likely seen too many Jewish Americans and Muslim Americans come together to talk about this, but it's important because it's possible, which is solidarity and community. So in both Passover and Ramadan, they emphasize the importance of community, solidarity in the face of oppression. In Ramadan, it's all about family, community, getting up together in the morning to have your morning meal and then breaking your fast together at sundown with your family, cooking together, making a meal together. But there's more to this than that, which is about that solidarity and community building are actually ways in which we can think about movements around justice and social equity. And so when communities come together, whether they're faith-based or others, there is a ton of power in the collective. And so there is this moment to recognize, like, what are going to be our core values and what are our core tenets, and how can we as a community with our power in numbers really think about the opportunity we have to support others, to uplift others' struggles, to shine light on their oppression, and how can we stand up and fight for that oppression. And so in the Muslim community, especially in the United States, it's really diverse. We also have Black Muslims, and we often also think about what are the unique struggles of Black Muslim Americans, and how can we together as a community also uplift their ongoing oppression in the United States. And what does that mean for furthering racial equity for us as a community of Muslim Americans who are very diverse?
Yeah, and Passover celebrates the Jewish people's collective struggle for liberation and encourages Jews to invite other community members into their homes for the Seder meal. It also makes us think of folks who are less fortunate than ourselves and those who may still be fighting for liberation today. And this is frankly why it boggles my mind that Jews can have the Seder meal every year, twice every year, and tell the story over and over, and still, in some cases, act as the subjugator and oppressor to others, even others of different beliefs and cultures and faiths who have nothing to do with our struggle. So, Sana, why are we talking about this now?
So obviously the calendars overlapped, and I have to mention, though we don't have representation from the Christian or Catholic community, this year Passover, Ramadan, and Easter overlapped, which I think I read somewhere online that happens only a few times every 30 years, something like that. It's a good moment to stop and think about interfaith dialogue and reflection. But beyond that, I said this at the beginning, and I wanted to share a little bit more about that. You can't really do social justice work in your organization if you haven't cultivated a space where all of your staff feels like they can bring their full selves to work, including their faith to work. I have to give credit to Catalyst Ed and really this culture of care and community that Rachel, Leona, Mel, and other senior leaders have created, where I have felt comfortable in sharing that I am fasting with my teammates. I regularly take off for my religious holidays, and I share what they are. I don't just say, PTO, I'm not available. I will often share. And what I love that during this Ramadan particularly, I've had so many team members reach out once they knew I was fasting and say, hey, I know I have that late afternoon meeting with you. You haven't had coffee or water all day. Do you want to do it tomorrow morning instead? How are you feeling? Do you feel energized around this today? That little bit of a check-in and creating space for me and my faith goes such a long way for me and allows me to really feel like I truly belong. And that's not, I think that happens by accident. It has to be intentional. And in, I think many organizations, particularly liberal and progressive organizations, it's challenging to have space for faith-based communities. And often faith-based communities are seen in conflict or in opposition to liberal or progressive spaces. I think both things can exist. I think we can call out what's problematic about faith-based communities and liberal and progressive organizations, and we can make space for dialogue and reflection in both of those. But it's important that we don't entirely push out entire communities just based on what we understand about their faith, and really create space for that dialogue, because it's really messy and it's really sticky. But when we have very stale and stagnant places where people can't fully be themselves at work because they're afraid of cancel culture or that they will not be accepted by their coworkers, it makes it really challenging to do good work together.
Yeah, I think that's huge. I think the separation of church and state, I do think we've taken that a little too far in putting a stance in the ground, and maybe having it be one place where there's so many other issues and they're also messy, and we have to deal with them because they're right in front of us every day. And I think this might be a place where we in the liberal progressive spaces have said, oh, let's just not worry about that one. Let's just do our own private religious thing. But I think you're right that the level of empathy we have here at Catalyst Ed for each other, and especially the level of empathy that you bring to your work, Sana, in raising this point as an important piece of dialogue, but in everything you do, is really critical and really gives me, a lot of warmth and heart. And I have learned so much through that. So I really want to thank you for leading with that empathy and with your true desire to recognize and make space for the diversity in all of us. So thank you for this conversation, Sana. I look forward to many more.
Thank you, Rachel. And if you're celebrating, Eid Mubarak.
Eid Mubarak.
A national nonprofit that helps education organizations, including schools, systems, state agencies, nonprofits, post-secondary institutions, and foundations, address their mission-critical needs and strengthen their organizational health and capacity. Now, we do this by connecting them to the trusted expertise, resources, and hands-on support they need to create excellent and equitable education outcomes for all students, especially those from marginalized communities. In this video, I wanted to take a few minutes to introduce you to our new strategic plan and share a bit about what inspires me as I look forward to the next 5 years. Let me start by sharing what we think of as capacity building. We see capacity building as the process of working with organizations to build, strengthen, and augment the skills, knowledge, systems, structures, culture, resources, and power that they need to serve their communities. Now, this can look like addressing a specific challenge, strengthening a specific area, or organizational transformation, which involves a deep shift in how the organization perceives and engages with the world in pursuit of its mission. So capacity building seen in this way has never been more important. Education leaders and their teams are looking for supports that strengthen their ability to meet the needs of all learners and adapt to this rapidly changing world. But here's the thing, our current approach to capacity building doesn't work. It is not accessible to all organizations, especially those who are closest to historically marginalized communities. It also does not reflect the needs or context of these organizations, and leaders and teams often don't have the necessary information to determine which approaches and providers are the right fit for them. Additionally, capacity building is often removed from organizational priorities, with equity being an afterthought. The result is that we are not investing enough or equitably in capacity building, and the investments we are making aren't giving us the kinds of results we seek. So given this, here are 5 principles that have defined and will continue to define our approach to equity-oriented capacity building at Catalyst 10. First, make capacity building accessible to more organizations, especially those who are closest to marginalized communities. 2, offer support that is responsive to organizational contexts and needs and is integrated with organizational strategy. 3, trust leaders and teams who know their context best and empower them to decide on their capacity building priorities and who they should work with. And this is really important. 4, offer a diverse and vetted set of providers so leaders and teams see quality options that make sense for them. And 5, ensure a focus on creating equitable outcomes for students, families, and communities. It's infused across all types of capacity building support. So how do we translate these principles into practice? When leaders and teams come to us, we first help them hone in on what kinds of support will be most impactful for their work. We then identify a diverse set of vetted providers from our network who would be a great fit for the project, and have a structured process so organizations can decide whom to work with. At times, we also offer consulting wallets or philanthropic resources to fund these projects. And finally, we create opportunities for organizations to learn from one another. What undergirds this work is our positionality. We are the only entity connecting education organizations to capacity building supports at scale. And we bring our diverse network of providers, our deep know-how on capacity building, our technology infrastructure, and our steadfast commitment to equity to this work. Now, if you're a numbers person, this slide is for you. Since 2020, we've grown our network to over 830 vetted providers who bring a diversity of skills, experiences, and perspectives to their work. We've responded to over 1,000 requests for support, with 94% of projects meeting their goals. We have allocated over $12 million of funding to organizations via wallets and have supported 6 networks. But more than the numbers, I am proud of what our partners say about us, about how we show up in our work and the value that they see us adding to them. So looking ahead to the next 5 years, we see ourselves deepening and broadening our direct impact by offering more and better ways that leaders and teams can access the expertise, resources, and supports that they need to build capacity. More broadly, at a systemic level, we are bringing together the people and building the infrastructure needed to support this work and shaping sector beliefs, understanding, and practices through thought leadership and storytelling. So given this, we are going to be differentiating our service model further. We will continue to offer the targeted supports to organizations in specific domains through discrete time-bound projects. In addition, we will be going deeper with a subset of proximate organizations in order to bring about the sustained organizational shifts that I talked about earlier. And we will also be launching an externally facing self-serve version of our matching platform so that many more organizations can access vital capacity quickly and easily. So as we map this path ahead, we see 5 priorities. I'm going to go through the first 3 really quickly. Our first impact goal is to continue helping organizations identify and leverage differentiated and equity-oriented capacity building supports, and to do this at scale through our tier 2 supports and our matching platform. We will also continue to build out and sustain this large and engaged network of diverse and highly qualified providers. Our aim is to serve over 1,000 organizations a year through this model, and we will measure our success along the dimensions of usage, quality, and outcomes. Our second impact goal is around intentionally investing resources in organizations and providers that are equity-oriented and proximate to historically marginalized communities within our broader work, so that they can make the significant organizational leaps in their growth, impact, and sustainability that they need. These entities will be the focus of our Tier 3 model, offering intense and integrated capacity building supports. And our third impact goal focuses on driving awareness and action through thought leadership and partnerships. We see a need for a sector-wide reimagining of capacity building so that it is equity-oriented and organization-driven and reduces rather than broadens disparities. We're looking forward to working with all of you and bringing together this broad coalition of researchers, practitioners, educators, community leaders, parents, policymakers, and funders to stimulate and guide this work. These 3 impact priorities will be supported by 2 internal priorities. We will continue to build an effective and equitable organization, and we will redouble our efforts to ensure our financial health and sustainability. So as I look forward, I see an opportunity that is ahead of us that is tremendous. We can truly reimagine capacity building so that every leader and educator with deep passion and commitment can access the supports they need to create and sustain transformational change for their students and communities, especially those who are most marginalized. This is something that I personally and our team is deeply inspired by, but we also know that we cannot do this alone. We will need visionaries who can dream with us, builders who can build with us, storytellers who can help change the narratives around capacity building, funders who can resource us, and so much more. We hope you will join us in partnership and community. Please email us using this link or QR code to stay connected with us. I really do want to hear from you. And I really look forward to staying in partnership with you as we enter into this next chapter of our growth and evolution. Thank you.